Hello and welcome to Facebook Live. This is Ben Carton, where I have these periodic opportunities to talk with people in our community about timely issues. So thank you for joining me on Facebook Live. I have two really special guests today. I'm very proud that are with me. Marc Morial, who is the president and CEO of the National Urban League, and the former mayor of the great city of New Orleans. It's great to have Marc with
Thanks,
us.
Senator.
And Hilary Shelton, who is the Washington director of the NAACP, a longtime friend and advocate on behalf of civil rights. Hilary, it's good to have you with me also. So it's good to have, we got two real
That's great to be
experts
with
here.
you.
Thank
And
you.
as we start this conversation, this has been a very difficult couple weeks with the George Floyd tragic murder, but it was pent-up anger that's been there for a long time. And this really brought it to the surface. And throughout our nation and throughout the world, there is a recognition that we have serious problems in our criminal justice system. And it's not just one isolated example that happened to get caught on a video, but it shocked us. 8 minutes and 46 seconds kneeling over his neck, taking away the life of that individual. It was a shocking moment. And it raised the point that many of us have heard about for a long time, that if you're African American, you grow up in fear, that the relationship that we should have in our community in law enforcement is in many communities feel that they're at odds with law enforcement. The law enforcement really isn't there to help them. And it goes beyond law enforcement, although we'll talk primarily today about law enforcement. It goes beyond law enforcement. We could talk about it in regards to our healthcare system and so many disparities that we see in our healthcare system that's really played out in COVID-19. Or we could talk about it in our economic system, where you see wage disparities. Or we could talk about it as far as wealth growth in America and see that in the opportunities for entrepreneurship. We have real problems in this country. And as I said on the floor of the United States Senate last week, in our Constitution, what we say first, and to form a more perfect union, is to establish justice. It's the first thing we talk about. And we have not succeeded in doing that to where we need to be. So we really need to listen to each other and find a way forward. This morning, there was announced a proposal that will be coming out from the Congressional Black Caucus, from the House Democratic leadership, from the Democratic leadership in the United States Senate. I'm proud to join this group that will include comprehensive legislation, and we're going to talk about that during Facebook Live. It includes two proposals that I have brought forward with the help, I might say, of Hilary Shelton and others in the civil rights movement. One to end racial and discriminatory profiling by police, and the other is to have accountability of law enforcement. So we have questions. We're going to have a conversation. But first, if I might, let me turn it over to Marc Morial, again, the president and CEO of the National Urban League and the former mayor of New Orleans.
Senator Cardin, let me say how much I appreciate you and your leadership and the opportunity to speak today, and to my colleague, friend and brother Hilary Shelton. Good to see you on the tube. And Hilary's been for many, many years a mainstay in the civil rights movement as a very visible advocate on Capitol Hill. Really, if no one knows more people, no one has a more golden Rolodex than Hilary Shelton in terms of his great breadth of friends and relationships, and that's so important. And Hilary certainly stands on the shoulders of great predecessors like Wade Henderson and Clarence Mitchell, who've given the NAACP a presence, and a presence not only for the NAACP, but for the civil rights community and all of Black America and all people who love and care for justice. So thank you, Hilary and Senator Cardin, for doing this. I want to put this in this context. 7 years ago, it was the night of the NBA All-Star game, I believe, in Orlando, Florida, just outside Orlando, in Sanford, when a young, promising teenage, young Black man, an aspiring teenager by the name of Trayvon Martin, lost his life walking through the parking lot of an apartment complex because he had gone to the store to buy a bag of Skittles and I believe some iced tea. And he lost his life. And there was an immediate outcry. We went down, participated in protests immediately. It shook the world. And Trayvon's mother, Sabrina Fulton, became a strong voice for all mothers whose sons had lost their lives at the hands of violence and at the hands of police, at the hands of vigilanteism. In this case, George Zimmerman was a wannabe cop who took matters into his own hand. Trayvon Martin, of course, lost his life. But at the end of the day, there was no accountability. Charges were brought and there was no conviction. And then there was a case of Michael Brown and Tamir Rice and Sandra Bland and Eric Garner. And I could name many, many others. And the pattern continued. Here was a black man unarmed, lost his life at the hands of the police. In the case of Sandra Bland, black woman, lost their life at the hands of the police, and no accountability, meaning no accountability. Didn't lose their job, been convicted, didn't suffer anything, but maybe the fact that the spotlight had been thrown on them for a period of time. That story of no accountability is documented by the Washington Post website, an incredible website through which they have built a database of all of the shootings of American people by the police over the last, most of the last decade. That website and that research shows that in 99% of the cases where a police officer shoots a citizen, the police officer suffers no criminal responsibility, no criminal liability. In none of the thousands of cases that have occurred over a period of years. The outrage is that the system has not the guts, not the nerve, not the DNA doesn't and can't and won't. And when Mr. Floyd lost his life, he immediately reminded you of the Eric Garner case. And in the Eric Garner case, the Justice Department sat on the case for 5 years, didn't do anything, and ran the case out to the end of the statute of limitations, and then brought no charges. And the New York Police Department, in an anguished way, fired the officer Daniel Pantaleo. Incomplete justice. And then when Mr. Floyd lost his life, once again, here was a videotape that anyone could see. Your eyes just don't lie. All can see, all can witness. And when you look at the videotape that was made by the courageous teenage girl, combined with the videotapes from security cameras and dash cams, what you see is Mr. Floyd did nothing, didn't resist, didn't push back, was unarmed, yet he lost his life in what looked to me like a 21st century lynching on the streets of Minneapolis with four Minneapolis police officers participating in this heinous act, knowing that they would take, with the arrogance that they would not be held accountable. And this is the story that has stunned the world. Protests in Hungary, protests in Korea, in the United States, big cities, small towns, villages and hamlets, in every region of the nation, spontaneous, powerful protests, not organized by any organization, not orchestrated by any leader, but spontaneous through the use of the internet. Teenagers, college students, senior citizens, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, American Indian, on the streets of America with a hue and a cry, enough is enough. It's time to end this pandemic of Black men and women, but Black men mainly, being killed by the police with zero accountability. So the bill, which the civil rights community worked very closely with the members of Congress who are the primary sponsors in the last week to 10 days, pulls together a range of ideas, some which go back, 50 years, many which go back within the last 50 years, to pull together a comprehensive bill to address police reform. I'll say this is not the time for a de minimis compromise, to do a few isolated or token things in the spirit of bipartisanship. This is a time when the American people across the board are saying, Congress, put the politics aside, put the past thinking aside, and let's pass a comprehensive police reform bill. Our job, Hilary, Senator Cardin, is educate people that the provisions in this bill are both reasonable, they are necessary, and they allow us to take a leap towards a system of accountability. But more work will be required, particularly at the local level, at state levels, with some of the recalcitrance we see from some police unions and some of the misadjusted approaches to our communities. Following this, we've got to address the issues of investing in these communities that have been locked out and left out for too long. So I'm proud to be a part of this discussion, because in this moment, legacy civil rights organizations, historic civil rights organizations like the NAACP and the National Urban League and the National Action Network and many, many others have been in the trenches on police misconduct, on police violence, on police reform for many, many years. And now is the time. We have to understand that even in the 1960s, when thousands and thousands and thousands marched, we never saw a simultaneous set of direct action by as broad and as wide a group of people at the same time as we're seeing today. And I hope our electeds, all of our elected officials, I know Senator Cardin, you do, because you've initiated this conversation, hear the cry, hear the pain, hear the want, and hear the desire. And you said it correctly. The purpose of the Constitution and the very essence of the nation is to promote justice. And this act is aptly called the Justice in Policing Act because of that. So thank you for having me for this discussion this afternoon.
Well, Mark, thank you. That's a great introduction. And your introduction of Hilary Shelton is one I agree with. It's a critically important position historically in our nations. We call it the 101st Senator. And Hilary Shelton has done a great job in promoting civil rights. And it's wonderful to have him here on our broadcast here. So, Hilary, do you think we can get major legislation passed?
Senator, I think now is the time, and I think we should be able to. One of the challenges we've had in years gone by as we legislation, and you've been right there with us, Senator. So it's wonderful to be with you yet again. And certainly with Marc Morial, the National Urban League, I'd like to say that they are our younger sibling, the NAACP. It's vital and actively engaged as anyone else in addressing our issues. So both of you on this. So, Senator, as you know, you introduced legislation for us in the Senate to address issues of racial profiling, because you knew that if our law enforcement community was going to be successful in carrying out their responsibility of serving and protecting, then very well, we needed to make sure the policies were in place and that it comes along with racial profiling would not be part of the scenario. If you don't have the trust of the communities you're serving, if you don't have the perception of integrity, as I've heard from every single attorney general, whether appointed by a Democrat or Republican, going back to Janet Reno, you can't be effective without that kind of involvement. We knew that collecting the data was one of the most important starts we could do. And we're grateful to you, Senator, for introducing that legislation for us in the United States Senate and moving beyond that to address the issues of the use of force as we've seen the convoluted approach we've gotten from the ground. When the question was asked as we watched on video, an African-American man shot to death from behind him in North Carolina, as you mentioned. And I thank Mark for mentioning Eric Garner in New York, as we watched police officers holding each of his limbs as another one choked him to death on television. And then we watched that again, what happened with George Floyd, as we saw him also being summarily executed on television, as the police officer stood there with his hands in his pocket, gloved, leaning into his neck on his knees, almost smirking as he did it. That three other police officers stood around him. No one even tapped him on the shoulder and said, look, I believe the man is dying. He's saying he can't breathe. Well, you let him up. But the other three police officers acted as if this was the same kind of problem going on. So, Senator, we're glad to be here as we're looking at this problem now and looking for solutions. Now, you also know that we called for and supported legislation in the past, took a very thorough review of our criminal justice system. You remember Senator Webb from Virginia being involved with you and others to say, look, it's been since the 1960s that we've done a serious review of how our criminal justice system works. New laws have been piled on and added, but there's been no narrative that runs through that legislation. There's been no connection through that in a way that makes sense. So we're experiencing the kind of problems that we are now. It's been outrageous, I would say, as we've watched time and time again, as another incident of an unarmed African-American man or woman or child were actually killed by law enforcement. We haven't forgotten about the law enforcement official that pulled up at a park in Cincinnati, Ohio. As a little boy was playing with a toy gun, someone called saying, go and check and make sure it's a toy, but he's on a playground. He has this gun in his hand that is a toy. The police officer pulls up and within seconds squeezes off a couple shots and kills the 12-year-old as he stands there on the playground. We know too many stories now, Senator, so we have to have a comprehensive approach to what we recognize as being a very broad and expansive problem. The system needs to be addressed. We need to research it, come up with the best solutions, and we need to make sure these kind of things never, ever happen again. We thought that something like coronavirus, in which we're all sequestered in our homes and other places and whatnot, might slow this thing down, but for some reason, even with people not being out as much as they are, even with coronavirus being a major threat to us all over the country, we're still seeing that our people are dying as a result of not having the right policies in place, the right training of our police officers. And as Mark mentioned very early, I want to keep driving this point home, Senator, the issue of accountability. Police officers have to be held accountable for what they do. They need to know that there's a way to do this and do it right. And if you don't, that very well you could lose your job. And if you cause the kind of harm we've seen, you may very well lose your freedom too. So in essence, we're delighted to move along to look at these issues, whether we talk about the beginning of the process from racial profiling on, whether we think about making sure that police officers are trained, and whether we set the policies for what is the acceptable use of force, so we don't continue to hear from leadership in police departments when these awful occurrences happen, that the police officer may have killed this person and this is awful, and we send our prayers out to the family. But too often what we hear is them saying, because of our lack of good, solid policy, this police officer did nothing wrong. So in essence, for them to do nothing wrong and take the lives of unarmed people, as we've seen from one end of the country to the other, even people that don't live in the United States, I think we've all seen this as well. As our demonstrations began here in the US, we also saw demonstrations happening in Europe. We saw demonstrations happening in South America. We saw demonstrations happening in Britain and other places saying that, look, this is not our country. We're not in the United States, but we can see from here that what's going on is wrong, and that's got to change. And we're here marching in the streets as well. Well, Senator, I'll stop there and thank you again for your leadership on this. And again, Mark, for his partnership at the National Urban League as we move ahead to try to address these major problems. Change this once and forever. Retrain police officers, and then utilize the tools of our government to hold them accountable all along the way.
Well, Hilary, thank you. You've answered some of the first questions we've had. I've had numerous calls to my office and calls here as to what legislation do we need to pass? Specifically, what can we do to end discrimination in our law enforcement? What type of laws need to pass? You've already mentioned two laws that I introduced, one to end the Racial and Religious Profiling Act, and the other, the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act. So let me just comment on those two, but there's a lot of other provisions that are in this comprehensive bill that was announced today, and I want to get into some of those provisions. In the two bills that I've introduced, it would make it wrong, illegal, and actionable if any law enforcement agency, whether it be federal, state, local, or auxiliary, uses discriminatory protected class profiling. It's certainly good law enforcement to use individual identifiers, but when you stigmatize entire class of people for special treatment, that's wrong, and that turns neighborhoods against police and ends up being less effective in keeping communities safe, and can be very dangerous, as we've seen in those who've lost their lives. So the bill effectively ends that practice in law enforcement and allows for enforcement so that we can make sure, in fact, that does not occur, including good statistical information. The second that deals with the Law Enforcement and Trust Integrity Act sets a standard of conduct that we expect police to follow, and have information when police officers do not comply with these standard practices. And we develop national standards as to what is expected in protecting the rights of all people in the community, and provides for the training of police officers in order to be able to carry that out. There are two bills that you, Hilary, have been promoting for a long time. I'm proud to be the sponsor, but the Coalition for Civil Rights have been behind both ending profiling and also law enforcement integrity and trust. But there are other provisions in this act. So let me, if I might, turn to some of the other provisions that are included in the bill that was announced this morning, including another question we received, and that is it legal to use that type of a choke hold that was used to take away Mr. Floyd's life? And should police ever be allowed to use that type of force? Hilary, why don't you start this time?
Oh, sure. The short answer is the use of the chokehold has been controversial going way back. I think those of us whose hair are about as white as mine remember when in California, Los Angeles very specifically, African Americans were dying at very high numbers because police officers would put them in the chokehold. Ridiculously enough, we saw the pattern and the practice within that of police officers utilizing that same chokehold on our folks, California moved right away to prohibit its use. But it's been unclear about whether that's been a nationwide abolition of the use of a chokehold along those lines. And I'll tell you what was ridiculous, Senator. As the question was asked about the chokehold, why is it that so many African Americans are the ones that are disproportionately dying as a result of the use of the chokehold? The law enforcement spokespeople in Los Angeles had the audacity to say the issue really is not that the police officers are behaving wrong, it's that there's something wrong with the construction of African Americans' necks. And as such, they're breaking and we're dying as they're being choked along those lines. And again, very recently, New York raised the issue again and reinforced now that prohibition to using that chokehold. There's no good reason for that to be allowed to be utilized when we've got so many other options as we're thinking about actually apprehending a suspect. And I continue to drive that point home as well. When police officers pull anyone over to stop them, apprehend them for any reason, they are simply suspects. There has been no trial. There's been no conviction of actually found guilty of doing anything wrong. There's a suspicion that something wrong may have been happening. So as we think about the chokehold, this is why this new legislation and new approach is so important. We want to make it clear that there are some tools, I include procedures in that toolkit that are utilized by law enforcement that should not be utilized the way it is. And when we're seeing that something that is supposed to be non-violent and able to actually suppress someone without serious injury, actually killing them, we know we've missed the point again. And as such, the oversight that these new bills will provide for us in changing these policies will be extremely helpful as we move through this process.
Mark, you have made it clear that it's been a very rare circumstance where police have been held accountable, certainly in the criminal courts, for their actions. So, how do we deal with that through statute? Police officers have certain immunities. That clearly has prevented, even where it's very obvious that they have violated the rights of the citizenry, from being held responsible and accountable. So, what type of a legislative approach can we take to make it easier to hold police officers accountable when they misuse their trust?
So it's a great question. So let me take criminal accountability first. And criminal accountability can attach. Criminal accountability can attach to the operation of a provision of the United States Criminal Code called 18 USC Section 242. And that provision, which makes it illegal for anyone under color of law to willfully is the key word, deny another person their constitutional rights on the account of race. So most prosecutors deem that statute to be unworkable because it requires you to get into a mens rea examination to determine what was in the officer's head. Did they willfully and intentionally deny someone's constitutional rights? That's a statute that can be reformed by Congress. So the Justice in Policing Act changes that willful standard to reckless disregard, so that if someone acting under color of law recklessly disregards the constitutional rights of another, then criminal liability attaches. That's number one. So this criminal liability, which speaks to the ability of the Justice Department and U.S. attorneys to be able to investigate and bring charges related to police misconduct, police violence, police brutality. Then secondarily, when it comes to civil cases, there's a provision in the United States Code 42 USC 1983, which is commonly used to bring civil cases against police officers and by extension municipalities for the actions of a police officer, which, quote, denies someone's constitutional rights. There's a defense that police officers can basically plead or posit or assert called qualified immunity. I'm immune for the most part, unless you can show again that I've clearly violated, and beyond, and this is a civil provision. So this Justice in Policing Act will fix those two accountability measures, and by fixing it, create a greater incentive. But I will say this: police brutality cases nowadays are often brought in the state court system. When I was a young lawyer, I brought numerous police brutality cases in the state court system because of the qualified immunity and the difficulty. And really, in those days, Reagan had a Reagan-appointed federal court down in the Eastern District of Louisiana, so it was a hostile place for those types of cases anyway. But the point I'm making, even today, police misconduct and violence cost cities, city of New York, $300 million a year in judgments and settlements. So we can change the law, and the Justice in Policing Act would change those two provisions I mentioned, as well as a number of others, and incorporate some of the things you've long championed. And that is the key. We have got to have changes in the law. There's a lot. Let's have a conversation. Let's analyze. The time for studies gone. The time for commissions are gone. The time for task forces is over. Now the best ideas, I think, are contained in this Justice in Policing Act. And I think we have to act on it as an important step, because we should all be saying, Congress should say, what can I do? Mayors and city council members should say, what can I do? And I think we've talked about that. State legislators can basically get rid of these special protections that many police officers have related to what's called Police Officer Bill of Rights, which gives the police more rights than you or I or anyone else in the event that there's a misconduct charge hanging over their head. And so we've got to fix, the system is broken and the laws are broken. So there's state laws we can fix, there's federal laws that we can fix, and the opportunity to fix the federal laws is now.
So I have a question from Allison, one of our constituents. She has written in, what specific mandatory training do Maryland officers receive in racism, anti-bias, and de-escalation techniques? Let me just expand that. She also asks about the diversity within our police departments, not only in Maryland, but throughout the country. So as we look at trying to end racism in policing in this country, can we train so that, or is this something that's inherent in the individual, in the culture of police? And it is one of the answers here to reach out and have a police force that is more representative of the population they're policing?
You want to take that, Hilary?
Yeah, I can at least begin. I think the approach has to begin even before the training. One of the things that the NAACP recommends, and others as well, is that we have to have a much more thorough system of actually filtering through those who want to be police officers. We find that too often we have those that are somehow deluded by their television shows, movies, and whatnot. See this as almost a cowboy approach. I don't want to say anything bad about our cowboys, but nonetheless, that they get involved because of the power that they're given, because of the opportunity they have to do what they want to do and get away with it. We know some people simply think that way. I like to believe that good, law-abiding folks, courageous, ready to put their lives on the line to provide the protection and security we need to our communities. But the first step always has to be able to filter through. That is to look at who wants to be there and the kind of things that we don't want in our law enforcement officials. And then that's where the policies begin, because that's where the training begins. We want to make sure our police officers are trained in the policies that will be most effective in being secure in our communities without the kind of collateral damage, if I might use that term for a moment, that we're experiencing now. For no good reason, people are dying at the hands of law enforcement. And again, law enforcement is working against itself when it allows those things to happen. Without that trust, we can't prevent the crimes from happening. Without that trust and perception of integrity, we can't solve those crimes after they occur if there isn't a trust that police officers will use the information coming from those living in our communities in a very helpful way. So we want the policies in place, the training to be there. And the most important thing I would argue is the issue of accountability, oversight. Police officers are doing what they're doing to provide protection for us, but when they misbehave, and they're human beings as well, but when they misbehave and are not carrying out those duties responsibly, then we must come down and they perhaps are not the kind of people that should be in law enforcement and should not be allowed to have the kind of authority that they have under normal circumstances over our everyday citizens and those living in our communities throughout the country. There's plenty we can do. And beginning with passing these good laws, and again, I support very strongly what Mark was just saying about these new laws that we're trying to get through now, we can begin making that difference.
Mark, how about police accountability boards? Do they work?
Boards or citizens complaint review boards can play a very important role if they're not toothless tigers. Sometimes they're set up as toothless tigers, and all they have the power to do is make recommendations, and the recommendations can be ignored. So I would encourage people who may want to look at police, civilian complaint review boards or police accountability boards, to understand they're horses of different colors, different types of police accountability boards. If you have a police accountability board or a civilian complaint review board, and you still have a highly restrictive collective bargaining agreement with unions, you're going to have an inherent conflict. And so this whole web, and what is the web? The web is a web that creates protections for police officers that no other public employee has. No other public employee has. Not the firefighter, not the tax collector, not the street worker, not the person that deals with millions and millions of dollars each day, not any elected official. And I think the time has come to level the playing field, to recognize that police work is important, police work has a degree of risk around it, but that's why you need complete accountability. And I'd add this: you have to fix the hiring system, and you've got to fix the training system, and you've got to do continuous training. But if you don't affect the culture, all the training in the world is for naught. What do I mean? What I mean is, if officers are subjected to an environment where the first day on the job, they get in the car, they're riding with their partner, and the partner says, I know what you heard in the academy, but let me tell you the lessons of the street. You have to have my back, I'm gonna have your back. If I need you to lie for me, I'll lie for you. We work together, we get no problems, we understand that that's the law of the street. Forget what you learned in the academy. Here's the way it works on the street. And young man or young lady, you want to survive on this job and in this department, you better do what I say. That's what many officers are subjected to. They're subjected to an informal system of learning how the systems on the streets go. And then you must have, with hiring, training, retraining, a system of discipline. And a police chief has to have the power to discipline officers without union interference. The officers should have rights, no doubt. But in this instance, the playing field is tilted. I saw Chief Ramsey, Chuck Ramsey, who was chief in Philadelphia and DC. And he shared that many instances where he fired an officer, they were reinstated through arbitration. And then he had instances where he's fired officers twice and they get reinstated through arbitration. So, this system, and we have to zero in on unions and collective bargaining agreements because they have too much power and they tend to be very rigid. They'll defend their officers no matter what. And that makes it much more difficult for a good chief, a good police superintendent who wants to do the right thing to implement sustainable reforms.
Thank you. I want to. I don't think any of us will ever forget the images a few days after Mr. Floyd's death in the protests in Washington, as we saw a peaceful demonstration cleared by the use of tear gas and horses in order to clear a path for the president for a photo op. When we think about America and we think about the strength of our country and the values of America, we're not a military state. We don't believe that the military has a role to play in this country from the point of view of law and order. This is why we have a civilian control of our country and civilian police, not military police. But the images we saw in dealing with that peaceful protest and the type of equipment that our local police are now using that remind us of military equipment has brought out a question from Ann, one of my constituents, who said, is there any restrictions on this military type of equipment being used by our local police? Oh, what's goes here?
So this, if my memory serves me correct, the process of allowing surplus unused military equipment to be provided to local police may have emerged after 9/11, when we got the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War began, and all of a sudden you had significant military spending, and it was designed to, quote, help cities with, quote unquote, the issues of terrorism. We now know that they've been used in other ways. And I think it's time to end the practice of providing military equipment to police departments, with the exception of maybe a vehicle. Sometimes it's a standard vehicle, not a tank, but a vehicle, or some things that are not going to be offensive. But the militarization of police makes the United States look like some sort of repressive, totalitarian regime. I mean, I remember when the president wanted to do a military parade on the 4th of July. My immediate reaction is, that's not the United States. We don't glorify the military. We respect the military and its uses, quote unquote, to defend us. And that's one way to look at it. We don't glorify the military and militarizing the police. Look, using tear gas and batons essentially to enforce a curfew is counterproductive to managing a mostly peaceful protest. And I just think that probably what happened here, Senator, you're closer to this than we are, is that when the president said he wanted to call out the military, there was objections from within the military. Military generals say, no, that's not our job. No, we're not going to send our men and women who are not trained in crowd control into the community as though our own people are enemies. And for those generals and former generals who stood up, I can't remember another instance in modern American history where the military stood up so forcefully and so publicly to the commander in chief. But they did, because they felt they had to, because they felt the decision making that was on the way was absolutely wrong. I noticed today that the National Guard is leaving Washington, D.C. Many of them have been called away. Look, it's another example of how not to handle. You see peaceful protests as a threat somehow. You want to crack down. You want to dominate the streets. You get the governors on the phone and you bawl them out and scold them. I just don't understand that kind of approach in the middle of a serious crisis. It would be more important to me for Attorney General Barr, right, to announce that he's going to conduct a pattern and practice investigation of the Minneapolis Police Department, that he's going to reverse his failed policy of not investigating civil rights complaints and not initiating pattern and practice investigations of unconstitutional police activities by police departments. So, we got here through bad policy and bad decision making.
Well, thanks for mentioning the pattern and practice investigations. The Freddie Gray episode in Baltimore brought out a pattern and practice problem in the Baltimore City Police Department. I was proud of our local leadership that all came together and asked the Justice Department to do that study. And it found that we had serious racism challenges within our law enforcement. And we set out on a path to correct that. And we have improved the relationship between our local communities and police. And the protests in Baltimore have been almost exclusively peaceful. And I think part of that is what it changed after Freddie Gray. The legislation that we've referred to many times enforces the fact that pattern and practice investigations are very important. They need to be thoroughly utilized and supported and enforced through the financial support on the orders. And allowing the states to have more ability, because under this administration, the Trump administration, they're not moving forward on those issues. So that's just another aspect to this comprehensive bill. Hilary, I want to get you on a question that was asked to me by Martha, one of my constituents. They asked a very good question. Mark mentions the fact that you see the type of force used against those who are peacefully demonstrating. And yes, maybe they did violate the curfew law, but does that require force in order to bring down that? Martha asks, why not have for nonviolent crimes a citation that you give the individual rather than having the person have to go through the physical custody, which can always lead to escalating a situation?
I think she's asking the right question. As we think about the challenges that we've had in that circumstance and a number of others, what we see is the misuse of force being utilized all too often. And she's right. So when we see what's happening, the vast majority of those outside, as a matter of fact, I walked over to the White House for a couple of these and walked with him from the White House down to the Capitol building as demonstrators to raise these issues. I can tell you this. What I saw in those that were participating was a very racially and ethnically diverse men and women marching together, outraged at the pattern and practice of what had happened against African Americans in our society and across the country. We're marching peacefully, raising as they know that that's a crucial part of what democracy is for us, that freedom of speech goes along with demonstration. Is what they were all doing and what all the marching was about in the first place. So she's right when she raises those concerns about the lack of necessity of seeing the kind of, in some cases, brutality that was being utilized against those marchers as they were in front of the White House and otherwise. We simply have to hone in on the snapshot of how those federal officers responded in their riot gear to those peaceful demonstrators as the president decided he would go across the street, walk through Lafayette Park and over to a church that was closed and had been boarded up because of a fire that occurred, brought their own Bible with them so they'd have something to hold up in front of the sign of the church as they did. And if we look at the top of utilizing those shields those police officers used against those peaceful demonstrators, again, it was outrageous. There is a better way. There are ways that we can do this and see things carried out in a way that they really should be, with peace and dignity, allowing voices to be heard and protecting life and other property from any other problems. We know that most of those that were involved in breaking glass or other things were not part of the peaceful demonstrators that had come to Washington or rose up in Washington to hold those peaceful demonstrations. We know that. We know that issues that I want to just address two issues you raised before. One of them, of course, was the 1088 program of the law enforcement, of our Department of Defense that gives away weapons that were actually purchased to be utilized in warfare to local police departments. Just to make one point, just drive this home just a tiny bit, Mark, you probably remember one of the issues on the list as we looked at Ferguson, Missouri, where we saw them utilizing percussion grenades and MRAPs and police officers dressed like they were actually in Afghanistan or walking through the streets of Iraq, actually providing that kind of military protection. But what we really saw happening was those weapons being now utilized by local police, even in a small town of 22,000 people, which is what Ferguson was at that time, to actually hold people at bay. In essence, we didn't need them. As a matter of fact, one of the things on the list, just as an example, was 16-inch bayonets. I'm trying to understand what a police department in a civilized society like the United States would need with a couple dozen of 16-inch bayonets. You know, those long knives they put at the end of the barrels when they're in a wartime situation. There's no good reason for it. There's no good need for it. But indeed, they were doing it because all the police department has to do is pay for the items to be shipped to them. And there are federal grants in which they can get money to pay for the shipping of those MRAPs, shipping of those other weapons, most of which are unnecessary for civilized society. And I agree with you, Mark. Things like infrared goggles are helpful to law enforcement regardless. Things like additional bulletproof vests, again, helpful to law enforcement. But assault weapons, as they've been shipped, bayonets, as they've been shipped, and other tools along those lines have no place in our streets on the United States of America, in which what are supposed to be friendly law enforcement entities providing protection and guidance to those that are on the streets. So, Senator, looking at these things from different angles, we want to make sure the 1088 program is held in account. The House did hold some hearings to address those concerns. Not enough has been done, and more should be done to address those concerns as well. And as we look at the issue of how peaceful demonstrators are treated, yes, there are better ways. We've seen, Mark, you mentioned Chief Ramsey, who I give a tremendous amount of respect for the great job he did for us here in Washington. As you know, we have many demonstrations in the nation's capital, peacefully coming out to raise concerns. And that's important. It's important that the American people continue to have the right, and it's important that our law enforcement officials and our elected officials know exactly what's going on under those circumstances and can act accordingly as well. There's much we can do, and she's right. Police officers could very well simply write a citation the same way they would if someone jaywalked. you get a citation. Someone parked their car in the wrong place, again, you get a citation. But there's no reason under most of those circumstances ever to consider apprehending and putting someone in jail for simply exercising their peaceful rights to demonstration, their peaceful rights to freedom of speech.
Thank you for that, Hilary. I appreciate that very much. I think that's an area we certainly could make major progress. Rosemary observed, a constituent of mine, observed that during the police presence at the demonstrations, that there were police officers who you could not identify. They were not wearing identification. And whether that is appropriate, and should police officers have identification so that you know that they really are who they say they are for the and what law enforcement agency they're representing?
I'll say this. I think, you'll see it's not uncommon that police departments will use undercover policemen who are plainclothes policemen for many, many uses and for many, many, many purposes. The problem sometimes arises when people seek to impersonate police officers or act as though they are police officers. Think about the two men down in Georgia who killed Ahmaud Arbery. They were in effect seeking to, in their own mind, conduct a citizen's arrest. So it is indeed tricky, and it's a difficult question as to whether you want to eliminate the ability of police to, in effect, use undercover police officers. One of the things that we've got to emphasize with the protests we've seen is that there were interlopers, I call them, who involved themselves in peaceful protests to create confusion and set fires and break windows and damage businesses and in Minneapolis, a police station. And so we may understand, feel, relate to the anger, but in no way should we allow those types of actions to become the narrative on police reform and police accountability and police brutality, because that takes the attention away from the death of Mr. Floyd. And we've got to keep the attention. These officers have been charged, but they've not been tried. They've not been tried. And Keith Ellison, former member of Congress, now Attorney General of Minnesota, has publicly stated these are going to be tough cases. And I take him at his word, because it's tough to prosecute police officers, even in an instance where there's so much evidence.
No question about it. And as we've seen historically, where we thought we had pretty strong cases where juries have disagreed, particularly where it's likely we don't know where the venue will be of a trial. So it's not necessarily the community in which the episode occurred will be where the jury is pulled from. So it really is a challenge. And then the challenges, as you pointed out earlier, has been the interpretation of some of the immunity laws that are very, very high standards. So that builds up the frustration that's out there.
It does, and we have this moment where the reaction to this case compels us to act. And I really think that that's what's so important. It's a moment of consciousness. If you look at the public opinion polling, when the public is asked, how do you feel the president has handled race relations issues in the United States, he gets a 65% vote of no confidence, which means that vote of no confidence is across the board in American life. It's not just progressives, it's not just Democrats, it's not just African Americans. And I don't think people want to live in a nation that does not have the resolve to address its long-standing racial issues, or live in a nation where this type of chaos is just one, if you will, shot away, one bad police incident away from your hometown. We want to fix it. We want to fix it now, and we can fix it if we have the determination to do it.
One of the themes that are in the legislation we've been talking about is transparency and collection of data. so that we really know what's going on, so that we can see the number of traffic stops that are being done by a police department, so that we can see the number of complaints that have been brought against officers, so we can see how those complaints have been handled, and that information is available. An officer who's found to have violated that trust, that information is available to other jurisdictions, so the other jurisdictions can protect themselves. All that's included in the legislation that was announced today, because we do need to unmask the way that law enforcement agencies are operating today, so that we have better information.
And with technology, it's so much easier to capture the data, store the data, digest the data, and make the data available. 30 years ago, everything was in paper files. It was a laborious, tedious process. Now, with technology and artificial intelligence, the ability to capture data, the ability to report on data and make it available to people is so important. We used a system called CompStat in New Orleans in the 1990s. It tracked where citizens' calls for service came for and where criminal activity. You could look at it on a map, and the meeting at which the CompStat numbers were talked about on a weekly basis was open to the general public. Open to the general public. You could walk in and you could sit through the meeting while the men and women went through the numbers on a map. Transparency is a great disinfectant. Sunlight is an important, if you will, tool of accountability. And I think that this bill does some of that. But even at the local level, state laws need to change in some instances because they prevent anyone from learning about the prior disciplinary history of an officer. Therefore, an officer can have a bad disciplinary history, and it's not available to be considered in the case of in the instance of a new case. So the change we need is across the board. I'm encouraging people to focus on what we need federally while planning for the steps that have to be taken locally.
Well, I'm so pleased to have our two special guests with me on Facebook
Thanks,
Live.
Senator.
I'm going to give you a chance for any final comments that you might have. We'll start first with Marc Morial, who is the president and CEO of the National Urban League and former mayor of New Orleans.
Hey, Senator Cardin, thank you. Hilary, Shelton, thank you. I've got to excuse myself for another meeting that's going to start in 2 minutes, but I want to thank you and look forward to working with you, Senator, on the Justice and Policing Act as it gets to the United States Senate. This is an important time. Your state, of course, Maryland with Baltimore and certainly Prince George's and Montgomery counties, Frederick, Maryland, Annapolis. I spent some of the Christmas holidays on the Eastern Shore, one of my first visits to the Eastern Shore, and it was a wonderful, wonderful chance to go to the Harriet Tubman home, the Harriet Tubman Library, or rather museum on the Eastern Shore. So I want to thank you for your leadership, and Hilary Shelton, always appreciate your powerful voice. So thank you for having me today, and I'm going to have to excuse myself now, and we'll catch up with you.
Well, thank you very much. You're welcome in Maryland at any time. So,
thank you.
And we're very proud of the National Park.
Yes.
So come back, visit us soon.
We'll be back. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good.
And to Hilary Shelton, who was my dear friend and one of the great leaders on civil rights, is in charge of the Washington office of the NAACP. Hilary.
Senator Cardin, thank you for putting this together. This is crucially important. Kind of depth of conversation, of course, having the president of the National Urban League and myself to sit with you and have this is extremely important. As we're closing out, just the important things for people to be actively involved in this process. Your leadership has been extraordinary. We're very grateful for it as we move to address this by doing things in a way we believe may actually help solve these problems. In order to manage these issues, and there are many problems we're going to have to manage, we have to first measure it. And measurement means the data that you talked about collecting and Marc raised as well is absolutely crucial if we're going to solve these problems along those lines. We need to look at this issue as pervasively and broadly as we know it to be, as we craft comprehensive solutions, beginning with a bill pending in the House, and of course, the two bills that you're moving for us in the U.S. Senate, as we move to provide some new policy, to provide greater oversight and more heavy accountability as we think about what happens in our communities throughout the country. So, Senator, thank you. Thank you for all you do with us, and it's been great spending lunchtime with you. Yeah. and I look forward to us doing more of this to help change our nation and make things better.
Well, Hilary, thank you very much. Black Lives Matter, and justice demands that we take action to correct our criminal justice system. We should have done this a long time ago. The opportunity is now. We have the blueprint in the legislation that was outlined this morning, and I'm hopeful that we'll see prompt action by both the House and Senate on this legislation. Justice demands that we move forward. And thank you all for joining us on Facebook Live. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And again, thank you for your commitment to justice.